The decade of the 1920s was highly significant in the history of steam. The little engine and railway are seen here in the last year of operation, 1929. As late as 1922, the company was still paying a dividend and was offered a place in the LNER, the member of the Big Four which absorbed most of the other railways in the eastern part of the country. These included the Great Eastern Railway, which had also offered to buy out the Southwold in 1893. These two dates covered the whole period of its prosperity. Moy was the local coal merchant. Probably the only other recorder of this railway oddity was the newsreel cameraman. Opened in 1879, it had 3 other locomotives, Halesworth, Blythe and Southwold. Having rejected both takeover offers, the Southwold's fall was rapid. It had been saddled with a 16-mile-an-hour speed limit throughout its life, and the introduction of buses with a 20-mile-an-hour speed in 1928 led to its closure a year later. It was just one of the first casualties in the war of attrition which would see the end of most rural lines during the next few decades. It's now time to turn to the Big Four, starting in time-honored fashion with the Great Western. The 1923 grouping affected the GWR less than any other railway, it having effectively had its own grouping in the Victorian period, when the various broad gauge companies had amalgamated in order better to fight their bitter enemies, the standard, or in their eyes, narrow gauge companies, which had proliferated elsewhere. It was a futile fight, which had ended in 1892 with the abolition of the broad gauge and marked the start of a great period of consolidation for the company. From this period came the first steam locomotives we see, the famous Dean Duke class. 60 of these double-framed 440s were built between 1895 and 99 for mixed traffic duties, the engines being at home on both local passenger and general freight duties, as seen here in the snow near Warwick. The general outline of the straight-top boiler with its tall chimney and enormous dome were Dean characteristics, as can also be seen on the next locomotives, Dean Goods 060s. There were 260 of these originating in 1883, most surviving into the 20s, although 20 had been rebuilt somewhat bizarrely into 262 tanks. Others had been called up for war service and gone abroad. A few of Dean's 240s survived in the 20s. This Barnum survived into the 30s. William Dean was succeeded by George Jackson Churchwood, probably the most innovative locomotive designer of all, who was to set his stamp on all subsequent Great Western locomotives, starting with the double-framed 440s. Built around the turn of the century, they were the first to display Churchwood's taper boiler and Belpaire firebox, with both small and large-wheeled examples being built. The latter were for express duties, but were to suffer large-scale withdrawals in the late 1920s. This fate also befell the pure Churchwood 440s, the first county class, one of which is seen at Worcester behind the Bulldog, whilst another heads east at Southall on the GWR main line. These were part of Churchwood's famous standardization policy for secondary services. Our last view is of one at Leamington Spa, a location which will act as a theme throughout our series, showing the changes through the decades of steam. This is an Aberdare, one of a series of 81 260s built from 1900 to 1907, again displaying Dean framing with the modern Churchwood boiler. A number ran with ROD tenders from withdrawn members of the Great Central designed 280s purchased from the government after the war, some 100 of which were used by the GWR. 50 of these were refurbished and kept as long-term members of the locomotive fleet, whilst the last 50 were run into the ground, all being withdrawn during the 1920s. This is Whitnash Cutting on the GWR's main line from London to Birmingham and the Mersey. These trains, climbing away from Leamington and at the station, have Churchwood's 2800 Class 280s at the head of trains of coal and mineral wagons on the sort of traffic for which these heavy freight engines were designed. The first of these was built as number 97 in 1903, one of 3 prototype standard locomotives built that year to test Churchwood's ideas in practice. It was absolutely right, and series production started in 1905. The principles of standardization extended to all parts of the machinery, from the use of 2 outside cylinders to the boiler, designated Standard Number 1. The latter was to give the GWR its familiar locomotive outline. Between 1905 and 1919, 84 of the class were built, but no more heavy freight engines were built during the 1920s, as the RODs fulfilled this role. Additional 2800s weren't built until 1938. These examples of the class are seen at work in the Leamington area in the late 1920s on heavy freight work between the Midlands and London. Churchwood had put forward 6 standard classes in 1901, one of which, a 5'8" 460, wasn't built. However, the scheme was expanded considerably with 14 variations, the 260 or Mogul replacing the 460. These were to prove extremely useful engines, 322 being built by 1925. The design wasn't part of either of the standardization schemes, but was produced from an amalgam of standard parts. It said that only 11 new drawings were required. As can be seen, they got everywhere, including Paddington, whose suburban services in the 20s still relied heavily on a Dean-era classic, the Metropolitan Tax. The design dated back to 1869, but the Paddington ones were the final development, produced in 1899, with larger side tanks and condensing gear. These services gave them their name, as they worked over the semi-underground lines of the Metropolitan Railway to Aldgate until 1907, and on goods traffic to Smithfield into the 1930s. Whilst Swindon had produced the 240 metros, Wolverhampton, the GWR's other works of the 19th century, had produced 042 tanks, the 517 class. These had a very similar lifespan, and examples are seen appropriately on the Northern Division in the 20s at Leamington and Worcester. Another product of the Dean Churchwood transitional period was the 3600 class of 242 tank. This was the only substantial use of this wheel arrangement on the GWR, as Churchwood standardized on 6-coupled small tanks thereafter. However, the 31 members of the class survived throughout the 20s. The standard design was the 4500 class. They were known as small prairies and were introduced from 1906 as a development of the 4400 prototypes. 75 were built by 1924. A further 100 were built in the 20s, the 4575 class, distinguished by their sloping tank tops, as seen here at Warwick. The county tanks were Churchwood standards and saw out the 20s. They were to be superseded by the number 2 boiler large prairies, the very similar-looking 6-coupled tanks developed from another of the 1903 prototypes, number 99. Only 40 of these were built by grouping, but construction started again in 1929. The first standard prototype of all was number 100, which was a large-wheeled 460. This was developed in the following year into number 98, which was the progenitor of probably the most famous of the early engines designed by Churchwood, the Saint class. These had the standard number 1 boiler like the 2800 heavy freight engines, and, including the prototypes, numbered 77 by 1913. They were initially the principal express passenger design, but after the war, the 4-cylinder version, the Star class, was used as the basis of future development, as we'll see shortly. However, the Saint was to become the basis of one of the few original designs of the 1920s by Churchwood's successor from 1922, Charles Collett. In 1924, he rebuilt St. Martin with 6-foot driving wheels and a larger cab to create the prototype of a new mixed traffic class, the 4900s, or Halls. Mass production started in 1928 with a batch of 80, 70 of which were completed in the 1920s. Various tender types were attached to these engines, 3,500-gallon Churchwood or Collet tenders to the earlier machines, and the standard 4,000-gallon Collet design to 4958 onwards. Returning to the pure Churchwood designs, which opened the 1920s, we next see the first of the famous four-cylinder classes, which, for many, epitomized the Great Western Railway. These are members of the Star class, 12 of which were built in 1922 and 23 to add to the 61 built before the war. This Princess, being passed by a large prairie at Leamington, is one of the last pre-war batch. The Stars were Churchwood's principal express passenger locomotives, utilizing the same standard number 1 boiler as the Saints and 2800s. They were derived from prototype number 40, a locomotive built in 1906, after the Saint prototypes had been compared with 3 French de Glen compounds. These had been purchased in 1903-5 by the GWR when Churchwood was developing his ideas for the future. The smooth running of the four-cylinder French engines led to the adoption of the layout on number 40, after which it was decided to use four-cylinder locomotives for the longer non-stop runs, the two-cylinder machines being considered more suitable for trains with more frequent stops. As with the Halls and Saints, by the late 20s, there were 3 varieties of tender in use on Stars. As this Star prepares to leave Leamington, its lineal descendant, a Castle, arrives from London. Churchwood had seen the necessity of increasing the power of the Stars by fitting an enlarged boiler, and had, in 1919, proposed the use of his standard number 7 boiler, as fitted to the large mixed traffic 280s, the 4700s. However, the design was too heavy at that time, so a new boiler, standard number 8, was designed and the Castle class produced under the auspices of Collet in 1923. This famous design was to prove to be the mainstay of GWR express passenger workings until the end of steam. In the 1920s, 30 were built, and 5 Stars updated to the newer design. In addition, Churchwood's solitary Pacific number 111, the Great Bear, was rebuilt as a Castle. The engines were used on express passenger duties and, as here, on milk trains, which were treated as express services in the days when the majority of the country's dairy produce, as with most freight, travelled by rail. By the mid-1920s, the Great Western civil engineers had upgraded the principal main lines to enable the introduction of a heavier express passenger type. The result was the famous King, or 6000 class. This was effectively the 1919 proposal, but updated thoroughly. 20 were built over a period of 13 months from June 1927 to July 1928, and put to work on expresses from Paddington to Plymouth and Bristol and Birmingham, as seen here. The Kings were to prove to be the final Great Western Express class, and the ultimate development of the four-cylinder type. At the time they were built, they were the most powerful passenger locomotives in Britain. One of their most noticeable features, the semi-outside framed front bogie, was the result of tight clearances between the frames to allow larger inside cylinders to be used. They were imposing machines, and it's fitting to end this review of GWR steam in the 1920s with this sequence of the famous doyen of the class, King George V. The engine is immaculate, as ever, with polished wheel rims and the full garter coat of arms on the tender, and sports the presentation medals on the cab side and bell on the buffer beam, which were mementos of its 1927 visit to the USA. We next visit the Southern Railway's most westerly outpost, Wadebridge. Here, 3 of William Beattie's 240 well tanks had outlasted their sisters, been rebuilt by his successors, Adams, Drummond and Urey, and were to outlast most of their own products. These gentlemen were the locomotive engineers of the London and South Western Railway, the largest constituent of the Southern, each of whose locomotives were stylish and effective. This is an Adams 440 of Class X6, one of 10 6'7" express machines, and it's followed by one of Dougal Drummond's mixed-traffic L11 440s, 40 of which dated from the first decade of the century. Drummond was an early advocate of standardization, even predating Churchwood. His M7044 tanks had many parts in common with the 440s and his 700 Class 060s, one of which is seen being shunted by the shed pilot A.S. Harris at 9 Elms. A.S. Harris was one of 3 locomotives acquired from one of the smaller southern constituents, the Plymouth, Devonport and South Western Junction Railway. The 700 was one of 30 such goods engines built by Dubbs & Co. of Glasgow, virtually a copy of locomotives designed by Drummond for the Caledonian Railway. They had been superheated by Urey, as had Drummond's acknowledged masterpieces his T9 Greyhounds. Number 728 was also built by Dubbs. 20 T9s with larger boilers were classified L12. One of these had been involved in the horrific disaster at Salisbury in 1906. Drummond's successor, Robert Urey, designed the first of a series of simple 2-cylinder 460s with Valschertz valve gear for the South Western. These were to form the basis of the Southern's principal express passenger and heavy freighter designs of the 1920s, the King Arthurs and S15s. This is the now preserved Salamiel. The Urey design was modified by the Southern's first CME, Richard Mansell, to produce the Arthurs. Mansell had come to the Southern from the Southeastern and Chatham, the second largest constituent. This is a Stirling-class B1, rebuilt by Wainwright. It's followed by an example of an earlier Stirling-class, the F1s, also a Wainwright rebuild. A Mansell-Wainwright D1 shunts past a Drummond T9. In 1925, 10 T9s were transferred to ex-SECR lines to replace F1s, transferred to the central section. The Mansell rebuilds were employed on continental boat traffic to Dover and Folkestone, where an E1 is seen, followed by one of Mansell's own Southern Moguls Class U. These small engines are Stirling Class R tanks. Of course, many were rebuilt by Wainwright to form Class R1, a process which continued until 1922. The very small tanks are Wainwright's own design, Class P. There were 8 of them, and they weren't very successful. Note the number. The A above the running number denotes an engine allocated to Ashford for maintenance, a numbering system used by the Southern throughout the 20s. Eastleigh engines had an E, and Brighton ones a B. The R passes with a single wagon. The R1 rebuilds had a domed boiler, and the classes gained fame as banking engines at Folkestone, up to 4 being used to bring boat trains up the fearsome 1 in 30 gradient from the harbour station. Back at Folkestone Junction Station, an H-tank pauses with a local passenger train, which includes some of the characteristic birdcage lookout stock. Details of the station and its environ show that little has changed under the Southern, although the R's wagon sports LMS initials on its sides. The offset platforms were characteristic of the Southeastern Railway. In many cases, they were either side of a level crossing, and footbridges were unnecessary. A Wainwright E-class is seen waiting before one of Mansell's own L1 Class 440s, a Southern-built version of the E and D rebuilds, passes on a boat train. It's followed by an SECR anomaly, another Class R, this time an 044 tank. 18 of these machines, another of which comes into Folkestone Junction to take us to Dover, were acquired from the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. So the combined SECR had 2 Class Rs. Curiously, both were modified to produce 2 classes R1. Our train is proceeding along Folkestone Warren, that unstable bit of land below the cliffs between Folkestone and Dover. In the 20s, there were still 2 small halts for passengers to alight in order to visit the beaches. The 2 tunnels seen from our train are Abbott's Cliff and Shakespeare, the latter being distinguished by its Norman-esque pointed twin bores. We are entering Dover via the southeastern main line, locals on which were diverted to run into the Chatham's Dover Priory station from 1914, when the Southeastern's Dover Town station was closed. The Southern was to rebuild this station at the end of the 1920s, concentrating local traffic here and continental traffic at Dover Marine. Of course, Dover's prime position for continental traffic was the reason for the Chatham and Southeastern rivalry, the plethora of stations in the port area, and the development of the railway-owned fleets of cross-channel ferries. The Southern continued this, adding new ferries to the fleet, consolidating the stations, and promoting the through ticketing of services to the continent. This local is heading away from the port at Hawkesbury Street Junction towards Priory, although this traffic largely ceased from the 11th of July 1927 with the closure of the Chatham's Harbour station. From then on, Dover Marine, opened in 1919, was the only station in the port, into which this Sterling B1440 is heading. On the right is the Lord Warden Hotel, which effectively bisected the station entrance, which could be accessed directly from east or west, the 2 routes to London giving the Southern immense flexibility in the running of boat trains. These views show the port avoiding line and another Wainwright Class E making for Marine Station with another boat train, formed of pre-grouping stock. In the engine holding sidings, a rebuilt sister E1 is ready to reverse down to the station to take over the return working, whilst a Wainwright C Class 060 is amongst the other locomotives awaiting work. The Marine Station was built at the landward end of the Admiralty Pier, which forms the western arm of the enclosed harbour. From the pier, we can see locomotives and rolling stock stabled at the back of the station area. The cross-channel trade was the reason for the building of Mansell's and the Southern's principal express passenger class of the 1920s, the Lord Nelsons. Here we see number E858, Lord Duncan, leaving Marine with a boat express via the southeastern main line. The 11 Nelsons were built between 1926 and 29, the prototype being briefly the most powerful passenger locomotive in the country, in theory. The truth was that they weren't terribly successful, although they did the job required of them. The most important part of this was the Southern's ultimate prestige train, the Golden Arrow, introduced on the 15th of May 1929. Our final view of 1920s Southern steam is of Sir Richard Grenville at Folkestone Junction with the down arrow. As we've seen, some railways were excluded from the grouping. Some were included but not incorporated into the Big Four. These were the joint lines, owned jointly by 2 or more of the larger companies, these owners subsequently being absorbed by different members of the Big Four. One such was the Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway, which connected the Southern Railway at Bournemouth with the LMS at Bath. Since 1876, it had been leased by the London and South Western Railway and the Midland Railway, so the lease of 999 years passed to their successors. The Midland took charge of S&D locomotive matters, including this small saddle tank. One of 3 known as Dazzlers and used at Radstock for shunting, it was withdrawn in 1929. It's seen at Highbridge, the S&D's original locomotive workshops, where it had been built in 1895. The S&D locomotive fleet remained independent throughout the 1920s with its own unique livery, royal blue. It also retained its own numbering series, the A suffix denoting engines on the duplicate list, a system once common but abandoned by the Big Four. Duplicate locomotives were those replaced by newer machines which had taken their numbers, so not themselves being withdrawn, having to be renumbered. Other Somerset and Dorset duplicates can be seen amongst this lineup of mostly ex-Midland types. This is a 3F, known as a Bulldog on the S&D. This is an S&D variant of the familiar Midland 440. The legend on the tender was in fully gilt-shaded lettering. The last two engines seen here are members of the legendary 7F class, a Midland design produced exclusively for the S&D. It's now time to turn to the LMS itself, starting in Scotland at Glasgow St Enoch Station in 1928, as a Smiley 440 undertakes station pilot duties. The LMS incorporated three of the largest Scottish companies, the Glasgow and South Western, seen here, the Caledonian and the Highland. The South West contributed a rather mixed bag of locomotives, having suffered a somewhat inconsistent locomotive policy. The last such were the huge and impressive Whiteleg Baltic tanks, but they failed to live up to expectations, giving the LMS a problem, and all six were withdrawn by 1935. LMS locomotive policy was dominated by the affairs of its English constituents, so the Scottish railways were, to a large extent, left to get on by themselves. Some transfers of stock took place, such as this Caledonian tank at St Enoch. Smaller Cali locos such as this Pug and Britain 042 contrasted with the railway's modern 460s, although it was the Highland Railway which had introduced the type with its Jones goods of 1894. The Highland had many unusual locomotives, including these 440 tanks and this spare parts 060 tank. 060s, however, are most commonly associated with the Midland Railway, the third largest pre-grouping company and second largest LMS constituent. These outside framed examples were built to the design of Matthew Kirtley, the railway's first locomotive engineer, when such designs were quite modern. Kirtley held the post from 1844 to 1873, when he was succeeded by Samuel Waite Johnson, who rebuilt these 1863 designed machines with his own boilers. His successor in 1903, Dealey, also rebuilt some of them, and 81 of them were called up for use by the Railway Operating Division in the First World War. The Midland was to rely on 060s for freight traffic throughout its existence. Whilst other companies progressively enlarged their freight locomotive types, as for example we've seen already on the Great Western, the Midland's philosophy was to run short, frequent trains rather than long ones. If the train was too heavy for one engine, another was added, so double-heading, frowned on by other railways, was virtually endemic on the Midland by the beginning of the 1920s. Johnson's inside-framed 2Fs of 1875 were the basis of the last Midland 060s, the 4Fs, produced by Dealey's successor Henry Fowler in 1911, and the medium-sized 3Fs, most of which were rebuilds from 2Fs. No less than 1,761 locomotives of this basic design were eventually built. As for freight, so for passenger and shunting duties, small engines were produced, such as these Kirtley Class 1 P240s and Johnson Class 1F 060 tanks. Again, Kirtley started them, and Johnson built the main series, 280 1Fs from 1874 to 1900. Thereafter, a larger version was produced, 60 being built by the Midland as Class 3F between 1899 and 1902. Number 1953 is one of these 3Fs, still in original condition at the end of the 20s. This, remarkably, was the last type of shunter for the Midland. Known as Ginties, even more remarkable is the fact that this was also to be the last design of steam shunter for the LMS, as updated by Fowler in 1919 with a modern cab and Belpaire boiler, seen on 1945. 422 engines to the revised pattern were built as an LMS standard type throughout the 20s. Only diesels ousted them. These scenes are at Kentish Town and St Pancras, with Kirtley double-framed 044 passenger tanks. For suburban work, Dealey tried to advance Midland ideas by producing larger machines, these 064 tanks, which were known as flat irons. 40 were built in 1907, but they were not a success. The Midland mainline passenger locomotive heritage followed the same pattern. Moderately sized 440s were originated by Johnson and gradually upgraded by his successors, the LMS inheriting a fleet of 350 machines built between 1876 and 1903, classified 2P. Most had been rebuilt, and the final variant, the Class 483, was to form the basis of the first LMS standard secondary passenger class. The final Johnson 440s were the 80 Class 3Ps or 700 class, which remained as built. From the Midland, the LMS inherited a self-contained commuter railway deep in the heart of LNER territory. This was the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway, whose distinctive 060 tender engine number 2898 is seen here on shed in 1929. This was one of a pair of this type, built in 1899, when the LTSR was still independent. The Midland took the railway over in 1912 and set about Midlandizing its stock. Locomotives received Midland boiler fittings and smoke box doors, as seen on this white-leg designed 062 tank, the last 4 of which were delivered after the takeover. The Tilbury's main claim to fame was its series of 442 tanks, which were built over a period from 1880. These are some of the earliest and smallest type, designed by Thomas Whiteleg, the railway's locomotive engineer, until 1910. 36 of these were built, all originally bearing names of places served by the LTSR. The railway used air braking, which was retained into LMS days, as it was self-contained. The LMS built a number of the final design of LTSR 442 tanks during the 1920s, the last being delivered in 1930. The Tilbury had built 16 from 1909, including some rebuilds from an earlier version introduced in 1897, and the LMS added 35. These are actually all examples of the final batch constructed, very much Midland-looking engines. The Westinghouse pumps for the air braking are much in evidence on the smoke box sides. A third variation of these handsome tanks was known as the intermediate class, being midway between those illustrated here. One Tilbury feature perpetuated into LMS days was the use of large destination boards. The final independent LTSR design was a series of 8 Baltic tanks built in 1912. Like the Glasgow ones, they were unsuccessful, and transferred to the Midland's own metals were withdrawn between 1929 and 1934. Another London suburban system inherited by the LMS was the North London Railway, which ran from its Broad Street terminus around the northern and western suburbs to Richmond on the southern. It was primarily built as a feeder line to the LNWR from the London Docklands, tracing its origins to the East and West India Docks and Birmingham Junction Railway of 1846. Its locomotive stock included 30 060 tanks designed by J.C. Park in 1879, and this celebrated 042 crane tank. This was a Sharp Stewart 040 saddle tank, rebuilt into this form in 1872. It was used as the Bow Road Works pilot until 1951. The North London was managed by the London and North Western Railway from 1909, but retained its locomotive and rolling stock independence until it was fully absorbed by that company in 1922, a year before the LMS was created. It leads us on naturally to the LNWR, the largest railway company in Great Britain, self-styled as the premier line, and of course the largest constituent of the LMS. The LNWR was a truly great railway. Formed by the union of the earliest trunk lines, the London and Birmingham, the Grand Junction and the Liverpool and Manchester, it had expanded to encompass the full length of the west coast of England as well as the north coast of Wales. It served the great industrial cities of the Midlands and the Northwest and monopolised the Irish trade. We join a party of 1920s railway enthusiasts as they climb the water treatment tower to review the array of northwestern motive power displayed below. The Northwestern had the largest and most modern fleet of locomotives of the LMS constituents in 1923, from four-cylinder 460s to powerful freight 080s. It owed this to a continuous engineering tradition established at Crewe by that redoubtable Victorian engineer, Francis Webb. A number of Webb's locomotives were passed to the LMS. His 240 Jumbos were probably his most successful express engines, his later compounds failing to last until the 20s. Dating from the 1870s, only a few Jumbos would see out the 20s. The longest lived were those transferred to the engineers department. Webb's successor was George Whale, who introduced the first modern 440s to the LNWR in 1904. This was the precursor class, well named as the main LNWR passenger fleet of the early part of the century devolved from these engines. There were 130 in this class, built between 1904 and 1907. They were simple two-cylinder machines, a godsend to the operating department after the complexities of the Webb compounds. By the 1920s, despite modernization in the form of superheating, they were primarily used on local passenger trains, as seen here near Rugby. Like all LNWR passenger tender engines, they bore names ranging from Cyclops through Senator to Fairy Queen and Problem. Whale also produced a series of 170 19-inch goods engines with 5'2" drivers. These were strictly freight engines rather than mixed traffic machines, quite an unusual wheel arrangement for such duties. The name was derived from the diameter of their two inside cylinders. They were the counterparts of Wales passenger 460s, the Experiments. LNWR locomotives certainly had interesting names. The 105 Experiments were followed by 246 Prince of Wales 460s, a development with superheaters and piston valves by Wales' successor, Charles Bowen Cook. There was very little visual difference between the two classes of 460, but the earlier engines weren't too successful, whilst the later ones continued to be built until 1924. As on the GWR, some LNWR locomotives were fitted with XROD tenders. These lasted rather longer than the locomotives themselves. By contrast with the Midland, the LNWR's big engine policy had produced no fewer than 480 460 passenger machines by grouping, the final batch being Prince of Wales's with outside valve gear, known as Tishies. The final design was the four-cylinder Clawton, 130 of which were the top-link engines. But the 1920s was to prove to be a difficult decade for the proud LNWR. On the formation of the LMS, the most important positions were to be filled on a seniority basis, and Midland men gained the ascendancy in both traffic and engineering matters. The Clawtons had their faults, but development was abandoned as the Midlands' philosophy of short and frequent trains with small locomotives was pursued by the new company. The rivalry between Crewe and Derby was the stuff of legends, but it was to cripple the LMS in its early days. Like the Midland, the LNWR had plenty of venerable 060 freight engines. These are some of the legendary cauliflowers produced by Webb, one of 3 classes of 060 to survive into the 20s. The others were the coal engines and the Ramsbottom DX goods, 857 of which had been built. In total, 623 060s of LNWR origin passed to the LMS in 1923. With their 5-feet drivers, the DXs and cauliflowers were frequently used on local passenger workings. However, the development of heavy freight locomotives was a priority on the LNWR, which carried a huge tonnage of coal as well as other commodities. Webb introduced the 8-coupled type as early as 1892, but their history was extremely complicated. In contrast to the passenger story, Midland practices had little effect on these engines. Webb produced 3- and 4-cylinder versions, 080 classes A and B. His successor, Whale, rebuilt many A's into 2-cylinder simples, classes C and D, the latter having large boilers. The Bs were then rebuilt to the new D pattern, using their existing inside cylinders, and classified G. Bowen Cook then added superheaters to form Class G1, which became known as Super Ds, being a superheated version of Class D. However, the definitive LNWR 8-coupled freight engine was the Class G2, built under Beam's superintendency in 1921 and 22, with higher boiler pressure. 60 were built new, and the various earlier classes were earmarked for conversion to this pattern, a process which was continued by the LMS throughout the 1920s and 30s, resulting in 509 modern freight engines. The LNWR had also bought some of the surplus RODs, bequeathing 50 to the LMS, which started withdrawing them in 1928, these being some of the final survivors. Tank locomotives on the Northwestern were very distinctive and diverse. This is a Bissell tank, and this is a special tank, Liverpool. The square tanks were fitted in connection with condensing apparatus, which had been removed by the 1920s. More conventional members of the special tanks with saddle tanks are also seen. They dated from the 1870s, and most were withdrawn during the 1920s. Most varieties of tank shapes were to be seen on the LNWR, the most common being the conventional side tank. There were vast numbers of 242 and 062 tanks dating from the Webb era. Both types were to be seen on motor train duties, these examples being seen on the lines around Rugby in 1929. The LNWR had experimented with self-contained steam rail cars in the first decade of the century, producing some of the most successful of the type in the country. However, like all other users of rail cars, they found their operational inflexibility and the necessity to service them at dirty sheds, complete with their carriage portions, ineffective. Only 7 rail cars were built, and thereafter conventional small tank engines were fitted with motor or auto train gear. The 242 tanks dated from the 1890s, all but 3 coming into LMS ownership. Most of the motor fittings were attached during the 1920s, the LMS pursuing the policy with enthusiasm. Duly reinvigorated, many of these little engines would see out the LMS itself, lasting until the mid-1950s. Whale and Bowen Cook also produced tank designs. Whale built a series of 50 442s in 1906, often referred to as precursor tanks, as they were contemporary with the 440 precursors. Not being rejuvenated by motor fittings, they didn't last as long as their smaller predecessors. One was withdrawn in the 20s, the remainder going in the next decade, as did Bowen Cook's 462 tanks of 1910. The final LNWR tanks were Beam's 084s, delivered after grouping in 1923. Before we see the main LMS designs of the 20s, we look at a few of the locomotives of one of the smaller constituent companies, the North Staffordshire Railway. The LMS regarded the 192 engines from the North Staffs as expendable and proceeded to withdraw them quite rapidly, all going by the end of the 1930s. The enthusiasts on this visit to Stoke were probably trying to record the survivors before they all went. The two 060 tanks are members of the D class. 1433 is a Class M, and these 062s were designated New L class. Originating in 1903 with 6 L class engines, the updated New Ls were still being produced by the grouping, the last 4 appearing as LMS engines. These larger engines are 064 tanks of classes F and C, differing only in the size of their driving wheels. They date from 1914 to 1919 and were the largest North Staffs engines. Despite being relatively young, they weren't excluded from the Holocaust and all went in the 1930s. The only North Staffs locomotives to survive were members of the New L class sold out of service, one of which, LMS built, survived long enough to reach preservation. The third largest English constituent of the LMS was the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, and it was to provide the first chief mechanical engineer of the LMS. Known principally for its use of these 242 tanks, of which kind it was the largest user in the country, and its vast fleet of freight 060s, the L&Y merged with the LNWR in 1921. Its CME, George Hughes, became CME of the combined company, and 2 years later, on the formation of the LMS, CME of the new group. Hughes built 30 of these imposing 460s for the Lanky, and a further 25 for the enlarged LNWR. On taking up office on the LMS, Hughes ordered a further 20, effectively the first LMS express passenger locomotives. But the early days of the LMS were bedeviled with politics, and the operating department, dominated by Midland Railway personnel, held sway over the locomotive department. The operators wanted Midland locomotive types, so, as we saw earlier, they ordered slightly modified versions of the 4 Midland standard classes, including 3F Ginty tanks for shunting. It seems strange that the operating department could order locomotives, but Hughes was near retirement, which came in 1925, and a Midland man, Sir Henry Fowler, the designer of these engines, succeeded him. The 4Fs were drafted onto LNWR routes, but weren't welcomed. Fowler tried to marry Midland and Northwestern practice to create his 7F080s, known as Austin 7s, but they were a dismal failure. The largest Midland Express engines were the 4P compounds. Fowler's version of these became the LMS Standard Express engines. Whilst they were fine machines and perfect for Midland operating purposes, the attempt to use them on ex-LNWR routes was a disaster, as the West Coast mainline operating practices were totally different. There was no doubt that the LNWR fleet urgently needed reinforcement, but it needed modern 460s. A crisis loomed. However, in one area, the Glasgow and Southwestern, the compounds were a very welcome relief for the mixed bag of locomotive stock, allowing the unsatisfactory Baltics to be taken off top-link work. There was one bright spot in the early 20s, as Hughes had set in motion the design of an advanced modern mixed traffic type. The result was the Class 5P5F 260, colloquially known as Crabs, which was the first genuine LMS design. The final details were altered by Fowler, so in appearance it was a cross between L&Y and Midland practice, especially in the use of the Midland-style tender, which didn't even match the width of the cab. But Fowler was not slavishly wedded to Midland ideas. Hughes had also set in motion a study to replace the various types of passenger tank locomotives with a modern machine. This was to be a 264 version of the Crab, so Fowler continued the process, making rather more changes than he had to the Mogul design. The class which emerged, with its modern valve gear and high boiler pressure, allowing smaller cylinders, set conventionally, was one of the most successful 1920s designs of all. This was effectively the final large passenger tank design in Britain, as subsequent designs through Stanier and Fairbairn to the last ones of all, the BR standards, were basically this design with different boilers. The story of the Royal Scots, which effectively settled the express problem, and the development of the 5X series of second-line passenger power from the Claughtons will be told in the 1930s part of this series, as we now have to turn to the final member of the Big Four, the London and North Eastern Railway, or LNER. The LNER incorporated all the major railways on the eastern side of the country and was to be the major rival to the LMS for traffic both to Scotland and the industrial heart of England. Right in the middle was the Great Central, a railway whose prosperity had been created in the South Yorkshire coalfields. This railway's CME was John George Robinson, designer of the ROD freight engines, which were a unifying theme on Britain's railways in the 20s, and our story. Here we see the progenitors of the RODs on their native metals. These were the GC's Class 8K. A GCR pom-pom follows, coupled to a Gresley J39. The pom-poms were the predecessors of the 8Ks. The railway also had smaller 060s by Robinson's predecessors Parker and Pollitt, as were these 062 tanks. Robinson, during his period of office from 1902 until the grouping, produced one of the most integrated and modern fleets of locomotives of any railway. His classes 11A, B and C 440s, LNER Class D9, were amongst the most elegant designs ever, and his Atlantics, two of which we see in the late 20s at Retford, were amongst the longest lived of their type. Robinson was a strong advocate of the 460 wheel arrangement, designing no fewer than 9 different types for all duties. The final design was Class 9Q, LNER B7, for mixed traffic duties, whilst his final passenger design was the 440 Director class. Both these types were perpetuated by the LNER, for which Robinson was the first choice as CME. However, aged 66 in 1923, he declined the post, recommending that the Great Northern's Nigel Gresley be appointed. This Claude Hamilton 440 and this B12 460 came from the Great Eastern Railway, which had a virtual monopoly of East Anglia. There was an urgent need for new locomotives on the LNER. These North British engines are seen at Edinburgh Waverley. Some local passenger engines, such as this Drummond 440 tank, were replaced by rail cars, 50 of these 1928 Sentinels being the last flowering of the steam rail car idea. As on the LMS, the more modern 440s remained useful on the internal Scottish routes, but the Atlantics used on the East Coast Main Line since the middle of the first decade of the century were already too small for the heavy trains on this route, and one of Gresley's priorities was to provide more powerful locomotives. All the partners on the East Coast had used Atlantics and large 440s on the Anglo-Scottish traffic, these being northeastern examples at Newcastle and York. Gresley had been CME of the third partner, the Great Northern, since 1914, and had already started work on providing that railway with a fleet of modern locomotives. His predecessor, Ivat, had designed these 440s, a number of which were sent to Scotland in the 1920s to supplement the North British stock. This one is leaving Perth. Ivat's Atlantics were his best-known work, both small and large boilered examples being built. Gresley followed the large boiler principle for his Great Northern H4 class, which became the first LNER standard class, the K3. This engine was built at Darlington and incorporated a northeastern design of cab. Other designs were built at Darlington in the 1920s, including the D49 440s. They were actually the first LNER passenger design, introduced in 1927, previous construction being of three-grouping designs. Similarly, the J38 and 39 060s were the first standard freight classes.